Welcome to the special edition of Marketplace Africa. I'm Eleni Jokos, and this week we come to you from the World Economic Forum on Africa here in Cape Town. Now, trade wars, trade tensions, protectionist policies, of course, these are the big headlines that we're seeing coming through globally. But African leaders are taking on a different approach. We are on the cusp of creating one of the largest free trade areas in the world, bringing together over 1 billion people with a combined GDP of $3.4 trillion.
Continental Free Trade Area aims to unlock economic potential. Of the 54 countries that have signed up, 27 governments have ratified the CFTA, according to South Africa's Trade Law Centre. That means the African Union has a mandate to implement. It includes the free movement of business people, elimination of tariffs on 90% of African goods, and the creation of a customs union to streamline trade. Policies that could see intra-Africa trade increase from 15% today to 25% by 2040.
So there are going to be clear winners and losers as the implementation of the Continental Free Trade Area gets underway. Vulnerable economies as well as very strong economies. How do we make it work for all? I'd like to now introduce my panelists, and I've got Albert Muchanga, Commissioner for Trade and Industry at the African Union Commission. We've got Arancha Gonzalez, Laya, Executive Director, International Trade Center, and Patrick Dlamini, Chief Executive Officer and Managing Director at the Development Bank of Southern Africa, as well as Ngaire Woods, the Dean at the University of Oxford School of Government. Thank you very much to all of you for joining us, and Your Excellency.
Thank you.
I'd like to start off with why it is that African economies are now wanting to embark on integration when the rest of the world is moving away from that and they're taking on protectionist and isolationist policies.
The two reasons are history and objective. History, when we ended colonialism beginning in 1963, we ended up with the 55 economies. Very fragmented, very small, and very uncompetitive. As a result, it was not possible to really come up with the very sustained programs of economic and structural transformation. Then there's also the issue of objective. Right in 1963, the leaders who founded the Organization of African Unit had a vision of creating a common market for Africa. But at that stage, it was not possible, of course. We do not have close infrastructure linkages. But as years have evolved, it's not yet very what we want, yeah. But we have basic infrastructure linkages. And when we are aggregating these economies, we are having a huge GDP coming out of it. And we also have a huge number of people who constitute one market, which is 1.27 billion people. And that opens possibilities of large economies of scale and scope. And that becomes very attractive to business. So we want to ensure that the historical legacy of fragmentation is now turned into defragmentation so that we create an integrated market.
And it's fascinating, Arancha, because many people are looking at this and saying, whoa, okay, everyone else is taking such a different approach. Can African countries make this work? Because we look at regional bodies at this point in time on the continent, and they haven't exactly lived up to expectations, apart from, for instance, the East African community. Do you think we're doing it at the right time, even though it's just so against the global trend?
Well, sometimes you have to be a bit of going against the global trend.
Yeah.
I have to say that Africa has been going against the trend also for the last 40 years. If I look at the world, America trades with itself 50% of what it trades totally. Asia, 60%. Europe, close to 70%. Africa, frankly, less than 15%. So they've also been going against the trend that others had been going of integrating their markets, understanding that this integration is part of the structural transformation of economies in this continent, many of which are just simply too small and are not delivering for their people. This is where we see unemployment, underemployment, lots of informal sector, and many youth that today cannot find opportunities in markets that are not working. So structural transformation have to do with integrating those markets. You know, Eleni, it's easier for an Africa to trade with the rest of the world than to trade with its neighbor. This cannot be.
And it's interesting because when you speak to big companies doing business on the continent across various jurisdictions, they always say the biggest headache we have is, of course, logistics and just getting from one country to the next. But there's also something that people talk about, and they say that we're not taking into account the informal trade that occurs between borders. Patrick, I'd like to get you in here. We keep talking about the fact that the regional integration could help significantly add, you know, a couple of percentage points to GDP across the continent. But it's almost like we know that when it comes to implementation on African policies, something happens that, of course, that perhaps creates a false dawn.
Thank you, Eleni. I think this is quite an interesting chapter in the life of the continent, as His Excellency actually alluded earlier on. But for regional integration to happen successfully, the continent has got to address its capabilities for that to happen. Here you're talking about the network of infrastructure that has got to allow for easy and quick facilitation of both people as well as goods to move within the intercontinentally. But the challenge is you have a lot of fragmentation. Also, if we were to look at our various economies, they're sitting actually at very different levels. Again, you have the biggest number of least developed countries sitting in sub-Saharan Africa. So this regional integration says it might be a binary issue where you will have winners and losers, but the idea of AU is to see how we can be able to create a shared prosperity for the people of the continent. And that can only happen if we become smart about how we go about this intercontinental free trade agreement. It's going to be extremely, extremely critical that the leadership for these respective countries really do what is right and they become smarter so that they are not actually then outsmarted by the next country.
Exactly. Well, Ngaire, I mean, this is where it becomes interesting because you've got vulnerable economies that don't have very strong manufacturing sectors. You've got strong countries like South Africa that have established manufacturing bases. And that means that South Africa can, for example, compete far better than a country that doesn't have an established manufacturing base. And this is where the notion of winners and losers come in, because how can countries really compete if they don't even have the infrastructure yet? Great that they have policies that they can trade, but hey, I haven't even built anything yet to be able to actively participate.
So, well, it's two things. I mean, the huge opportunity is that if Africa comes together in this free trade agreement, quite simply, countries and industries can help one another grow. I live in a town called Oxford in the United Kingdom, where when BMW make their minis, each of those minis, the parts of those minis travel many times across Europe and across the Channel. And they do so completely freely until now, which has made it possible to create a very, very profitable export industry. I looked at the figures on what it takes to move one container from Cape Town to Luanda on this continent. Some 56 customs signatures, 84 customs stamps, 83 documents, 28 SADC certificates. You know, the simple fact is that at the moment, you can't build a value chain across the continent, which means that different countries and different communities can do what they do best and produce one thing which you could then export, whether it's to Europe or to another part of the continent itself. That's the big opportunity. Now, you're quite right. In harvesting that opportunity, we shouldn't just say, throw down all the barriers and then just let the invisible hand do its work. We know from other countries, think about Mexico after NAFTA, that the consequences of liberalization can really damage some of the poorest in these countries. But that's not a reason not to do it. That's a reason to have really great policies of support. And I think the European Union has done some of that very well.
Well, I'm so glad you mentioned Brexit, because that means I didn't actually have to instigate that. So let's talk about the lessons that can be learned here, because clearly there's some countries that feel that, look, these policies haven't benefited, the industries in these countries, and they want to bring business back home. They want to engage in their own, trade deals. What can we draw from this scenario that's playing out in Europe?
It's how to keep the political debate and the economic advantages linked together. So what's happened in Britain is to have a deep free trade agreement, you really do have to pool sovereignty. You have to decide, we collectively agree that these qualifications to be a plumber or a doctor or a dentist or an engineer, we will recognize. And that means really working together to give that recognition. Now, if people in your country don't trust you as a government, if people in your country think that the arrangements that you're coming up with only benefit a small minority, they will start looking at those arrangements and saying, we want our sovereignty back. We want to take back control. And that's the situation that Britain finds itself in.
So, Your Excellency, listening to that experience, the AU has the mandate to actually do this, right? I mean, you guys are working with member states at the moment, now that you've got enough countries that have ratified. How are you guys drawing on these problems, these global problems that are so, that are going to impact everyone, including many African countries, and taking that into consideration when you're drawing up policies?
Well, I think the reality is that if we do not create a large African market space, the problems that are emerging around the world will be able to hit Africa much worse. But when we're able to increase trade among ourselves, I think that will act as a buffer. A lot of issues have been raised which are challenges. I agree. We face a lot of challenges. But we've got a very, very aggressive program of trade facilitation so that we minimize the number of documents that have to be signed when some goods and services cross borders. And we also have a program of connecting the customs administrations so that they are able to monitor the flow of goods and services across the continent. And then we also have a program of coming up with the one-stop border posts so that if some inspection is done on one part, you don't need to have inspections at each and every border.
But already the inspection points that you speak of are just so inefficient. So
yes.
You've got to do work from the ground up to make this work.
Yes, in some of them we've got technology that is being used so that you really don't have to do it physically. So, like I'm saying, the status quo is very, very, very challenging, but we are laying out a program to ensure that we meet these challenges. Because life is about the capacity to meet challenges. The challenges will be there in life. And the fact of the matter is that when you meet the challenge, another challenge is going to emerge. The day that the African Continental Free Trade Area was signed in Kigali, I sat down in my room to come up with a list of challenges that we are going to face. And I came up with a list of 58. And after this now, I've got 50 more challenges. But that's part of life.
What's the number now?
It's going up, but the issue is that we are able to seize these challenges and address them. One of the challenges that there's also the fear of the unknown. The African Continental Free Trade Area is a huge project. So countries will not really sign on readily. They don't know what tomorrow may bring. But we have been able to advocate, and that's why we've been able to have a very fast rate of signature. We have had a very fast rate of ratification. This agreement is the first one in the history of lawmaking in the African Union to be ratified in a period of 1 year, 1 month, 1 week, and 1 day. And ordinarily, it takes about 5 years.
I mean, this just shows that, all African countries that have signed up are actually really committed.
Yes.
So, Patrick, I want to talk about the 90%, tariff elimination, the free movement of business people. As, you're in the developmental game and, of course, financing. How is that going to change the way you guys approach things? And is it going to increase your business?
It's supposed to be a very exciting times, actually, for us, because we're here to facilitate this Continental Free Trade Agreement by making sure that we're able to provide the requisite infrastructure to enable it to happen, and to happen efficiently, and also to make sure that when we're able to do this, we can also be able to come up with the technology infrastructure that will make sure that we don't make the same mistakes as other free trade blocks have actually gone through. So now we also can be able to make sure that you know that country A has only a capacity to produce an X number of certain goods. So you are not going to have an outsider coming in and using that country. All of a sudden, the country with an X number of capacity now produces X plus Y. And then we say, but that's not the capacity of your economy. Yeah. Your technology can be able actually to pick these things up, predictive analytics, and AI can be able actually to now tell you, look into that, there is a problem there.
You see, you're bringing up a really interesting point here because we already have these stories playing out on the continent where countries are already not playing fairly on the trade front, where they're importing certain goods, you don't know where the country of origin is, and then suddenly it's being dumped into neighboring countries at a far cheaper rate, destroying the local industries. That's going to be a tough one. Is that part of the problems that you're going to be facing?
Yes, well, in technical terms, it's called trade deflection.
Yeah.
We are aware that that is going to emerge. And in spite of the fact that we've got rules of origin, we know that countries can work around that to circumvent the rules and transship the goods. So we'll be monitoring very closely, working very closely with the regional economic communities to ensure that we are able to get the data on what is going on around the market. And the evidence that we generate, that is going to really encourage member states to go towards a common external tariff. And when you establish a customs union and eventually an internal market, you eliminate the possibilities of trade deflection.
So Arancha, I want you to jump in here. How can rules of origin make or break a trade agreement of this kind?
I mean, rules of origin, which is the passport that goods have in order to cross borders, just like people have passports, goods also have passports because you want to give a preference to the products that have been manufactured using components from the continent rather than from outside. Minimal transformation is a means to avoid that. It's a means to encourage more value added with inputs from the continent. So there will be rules of origin that are being negotiated by very smart, brainy negotiators. But what I wanted to say, Eleni, is that what matters in this discussion first is to understand that the Continental Free Trade Agreement will make trade possible, okay, possible, provided the agreement is implemented. So I'm already putting the different ingredients, and this is why we are supporting, as an organization of the UN, Albert, very much in the implementation of this agreement. But to move from making trade possible, you still got to jump to making it happen.
Yeah, so how do we do that?
Okay, this is where both Ngaire and Patrick are right. You need more ingredients than just a trade agreement. And in the past, some countries stopped doing the trade agreement. And others said this trade agreement plus. What's the plus that Africa needs to look at? In my view, the first plus, if we want this trade agreement to be used, is to foster skills for entrepreneurship. Because at the end of the day, this is what will help doing the value added in the continent. The second one is fixing a problem that this continent has, which is access to credit and capital. Credit and capital markets are not working for the young entrepreneurs in this continent, in many other places of the world, by the way. And the third one is the digital economy that has, again, to be also tagged and connected with this Continental Free Trade Agreement to move from having a theoretical access and a theoretical market to having entrepreneurs really thriving, doing value added in this continent.
Exactly, because I mean, you can have a policy and then, it's not like overnight, suddenly, you're going to increase intra-African trade dramatically, right? You still need to put the infrastructure in place and make sure that the message is getting down to those 27 stops between Lagos and Abidjan so that they know what to do. Ngaire, I want to talk about the competitive environment. And, for me, I've spoken to so many leaders, and they say, tariffs and protectionism has helped create billionaires on the continent because it's helped create a very strong industry without the competition. Now you want to eliminate tariffs. Does that mean you're going to kill the opportunities for entrepreneurs to truly establish big companies?
No, I don't think you do, and I don't think that's what the evidence tells us. But the devil is in the detail. I mean, it could, if it's not done in the right way, but it doesn't necessarily do it. I don't think that's an argument not to do it. And I do think we also need to step back to what you said at the beginning, Eleni, that African countries are living in a world in which global trade rules are being eroded very quickly as China and the United States spiral into a trade war, as other countries are starting to use more and more protectionism. Individual countries in Africa can rely even less than they could before on a global trade order, and that's a reason for Africa to come together as a free trade area and to bargain as one enormous market in making those deals with the other elephants in the world economy. Because individually, there's no African country, not even this one, that can take a strong negotiating position vis-a-vis the large powers in the country, in the world.
As the world looks on to what the continent is doing, Ngaire, do you think that people are going to say, hold on, we're going to lose our competitive edge on the continent because it suits us, that intra-Africa trade is only at 15% because we want to be, big trading partners with the continent. Do you think people are watching us closely?
I think from the rest of the world's perspective, people are going to watch whether this is implemented, right? Whether it actually happens and at what pace. But then if we look at the other free trade areas in the world, what I would expect us to start seeing is people thinking creatively about what kinds of joint ventures across the continent can build even stronger production networks across Africa. That's the kind of investment that would be opened up if you could actually make this free trade region a deep reality.
Infrastructure sharing. How do we make sure that we can facilitate trade? I mean, we're seeing some projects, again, I use the East African region as an example of sharing railroads and sharing infrastructure. How can that assist and propel things, Your Excellency?
Well, the establishment of the African Continental Free Trade Area has motivated a number of stakeholders to come forward. And one of the stakeholders, African entrepreneurs, they've organized themselves into a club called the Afro Champions. And this year, we had a meeting with them in Kenya, Nairobi, to look at ways of meeting the infrastructure gap in Africa. The budget is about 130 to 170 billion US dollars per year, and about 90 is underfunded. So they are going to come up with a framework, financing framework, which is going to be rolled out in October this year to enable Africa meet the financing gap on infrastructure within 10 years. And it's going to be public-private partnerships. And when the draft document is out, it will go through the AU structures up to the summit so that it's also adopted by the summit. So we are working with the private sector. That is point number one. Point number two, as we develop this large market, even players outside the continent see opportunities now to come into public-private partnerships. So they're also going to come on board. But over and above this, the African Export-Import Bank has indicated that the current level of infrastructure connectivity across Africa, although it's not very efficient, is capable of clearing a trade worth about $1 trillion US per year. So it's there a problem, and we're solving it. But within the existing infrastructure, although it's not very efficient, we can increase the level of intra-African trade.
By how much? I mean, what percentage?
Well, I think the figure has already been given, but our calculations is that if we start trading 1st of July 2020, the current level, other people say 15%, we're saying 18%. The current level of 18% of intra-African trade, from trade liberalization alone, is going to increase by 52.3%. If we remove non-tariff barriers, we're going to grow by 100%. And over and above that, there is the underclass. Arancha talked about it. they are not captured in the intra-African trade. These are the informal cross-border traders. We're going to come up with a digital payments and the settlement platform. And when they use that digital payments and the settlement platform, we'll be able to capture trade flows through the informal trade. And that is also going to increase the level of intra-African trade. So the opportunities are there.
So Arancha, I mean, from what we're hearing, even with the current infrastructure that we have, these are the numbers that we're looking at, that we can increase intra-Africa trade by 52% in the next few years, which of course is very exciting. But what do you think the first thing needs to be? We know that the AU is obviously working very strongly and, to get this done by mid-2020. What is your advice? What are you guys saying in terms of priorities?
Yeah, the priority now is to materialize slowly but steadily. It will not happen in one go, but to materialize steadily but very clearly in installments, the promises that have been made when signing and ratifying the agreement. It's called implementation. It's a very boring, very technocratic word. If anyone has a better word, please let me know, because it's becoming a bit used. But it's basically plans that will tell us every 6 months, every year, every 2 years, how much are these obstacles being reduced. We are setting up, together with Albert and with financing from the European Union that has a bit of expertise in this, a so-called African Trade Observatory, precisely to be able to monitor on a month-by-month basis how much are these barriers being dismantled.
But I want to play devil's advocate here, because since I started my career, we've been talking about intra-Africa trade being stuck at 15%. The needle hasn't moved despite regional bodies saying we're going to work harder, we're going to try harder. Why hasn't it moved for so long? And what is going to be so different now? A piece of policy is not really going to be the catalyst, maybe it will, but is it implementable? Implementation is important, but is it actually implementable on the ground, Arancha?
It is perfectly implementable, and what has changed is now we have leaders of these 54 countries putting their neck on the line for this agreement. Yeah. Going in public, signing it and saying, we will take this forward. Now, if they don't take this forward, if they don't implement it, it's a bit of credibility that they will be losing, apart from the big opportunities that will be lost if investors realize that this is not being implemented. That's the game changer, is that there is much more political energy today than there has ever been in integration in Africa.
I think it's going to be a matter of also of addressing the challenges of border posts. Because if we really want to give a true meaning to this intercontinental free trade agreement, we need to have one-stop border post and common rules or harmonious regulations that will make sure that the ease of the flow of goods happens much more quicker, much more easier, as well as people.
So what happens at the border between South Africa and Zimbabwe should happen at the border between, other countries.
This is the thing.
It's the same standard
Standardization of regulation is going to be extremely important, and standardization of systems is going to be extremely important. Capacitation of our infrastructure, like at the ports, is going to be extremely productivity, optimal productivity there is going to be extremely important, because once you have those things, then you can then be able to start seeing goods move much more faster, because perishable goods have got no chance to move within the continent. Yeah. Otherwise, you'll have then actually to air freight them, and that's very expensive. But if you really want to make sure what the Europeans and what the Asians trading blocs have been able to do, we need to make sure that we do that even much more better. But again, capacitation of our infrastructure and of our people within the region is going to be extremely important.
And Patrick, one of the things that we've actually seen is that ports in Africa do compete. There was a story recently that we saw more efficient movement of goods from Zimbabwe and Mozambique to the Durban port in South Africa, and then yet someone said, well, hold on, what about just getting stuff to the Mozambican port as opposed to carting it all the way to Durban? And the point is that even ports within South Africa compete against each other. So the competition element is important, and I think we cannot underestimate that yes. Everyone wants a piece of the pie.
It's the productivity actually that is the question here. Because yes, they might be competing with each other, but they haven't actually mastered the productivity levels of it. Because, look at what actually you get out of a Durban container terminal. The movements of the 20-foot equivalent of a container per hour vis-a-vis what actually you get in other nations. So even with the kinds of vessels as well that actually call at our ports, you also have vessels that are old, they have very old cranage. When they try to work, they break more often than not. And what productivity can you get there? So again, the capacity at our ports is going to be extremely important. Again, we have also the issue of rail and the fragmentation of the rail gauges on our continent. We have got narrow gauge, wide gauge, Cape gauge, standard gauge. Again, the interoperability of our system then becomes very difficult. These are the kinds of things that we need to start grappling with as soon as possible so that going forward, the harmonization of trade and the ease of movement of goods within the continent is much more quicker, much more easy. Also, we need also vessels that are going to be flag carriers within the continent. Because at this point in time, we do not have those. So we need more of those that can be able to take goods from we have 37 sea-facing countries on the continent. So there is no reason why we cannot actually be able to be much more productive if we pay attention to it.
Exactly, and the reality is that we've actually seen a lot of ports spending quite a bit of money in upgrading. Ngaire, I'd like to shift gears a little bit and talk about the fact that when we talk about the continent, people say, listen, remember, Africa is not one country, it's 54 countries. And it almost seems like we're moving towards trying to be viewed as one regional bloc. And when we think of Europe, yes, we know there are many countries in it, but at the end of the day, it's still seen very cohesive. Do we need to start taking a more cohesive approach to the continent as a whole, perception-wise?
That's a great question, Eleni, because I think beware of trying to force people into an identity with which they're not comfortable. That Europe has two lessons. One is the enormous gains to be made from creating a genuine single market. And that's the positive lesson that Africa could learn, and how much power that will give the continent in international trade negotiations. But the second lesson is be very cautious about, for example, a monetary union across the continent. Be very cautious about the other integration measures which can take away from government some of the powers that people will expect them to use. So I think there's two lessons there. The other point that I would pick up, Eleni, you talked about the vested interests that are going to make this difficult to implement, and you're right. There are people on this continent who make, huge amounts from the status quo and the tariffs and the barriers that exist. But on the positive side, let's not forget that once governments show that they are absolutely determined to change the rules, those interests change. And I saw this with NAFTA, where you had a company like Corning Glass in the United States completely opposed to NAFTA until they realized that it was actually going to happen. And then they immediately started jumping in and creating joint ventures with Mexican companies and became a real force for an integrated market.
So I'm going to ask you this. Do you think, look, for a very long time we're saying, look, China doesn't play fair and square, intervening in their currency, and it's really cheap, so it's very difficult to compete with goods that are subsidized and so forth. Do you think that there is merit in embarking on a so-called trade war with China so that it can level out the playing field globally, or do you think this is going to be net negative? And again, I'm playing devil's advocate here, Ngaire.
Well, I think most countries think that other countries don't quite play fair and square, and so there's a different perspective you can have from each country in the world. The United States government wants to reset the relationship with China, and that's fair enough to want to reset a relationship with a country that's changed enormously. However, that said, it doesn't look as though economically or politically the way they're going about that is working. I don't think it provides a good model for how the African continent might want to negotiate with China.
And this is an important one, Your Excellency, because China's relationship with Africa is growing extensively, and I think we have to make it clear that this trade agreement is for African goods, goods made in Africa. How are big powers like China that are trying very hard to increase trade with the continent going to be impacted by this? And are we going to try reset our relationship with these powers?
Well, before I answer that question, let me just say, since I'm from the African Union, in the African Union, we've got 55 member states and 55 countries, and that's the Sahara Republic. Yes. The trade agreement is principally focused on creating a free trade area among African countries. There are going to be tariff levels with 30 parties. And since we are in a free trade area arrangement, we are not likely to have uniform tariff levels with 30 parties with other member states. But the tariffs are not going to be lowered for them, and they understand that. So what we expect is that in order to enjoy the benefits of a free trade area and enjoy the use of the rules of origin, a lot of investments are going to come into Africa so that they can, the goods can be made in Africa and they can be traded across the rest of the market duty-free. However, the goods coming from the other parts will still be facing duties charged on them. In the long term, there's a possibility, especially when we've got a common external tariff under the African Customs Union and eventually the internal market, there is a possibility that Africa is going to have free trade agreements with other parties around the world. But for now, we are focusing on ourselves to create a good market so that we are more competitive. Like I said earlier, if we don't move in that direction, I think the development challenges are going to be much, much worse for Africa. So let's undertake structural transformation by use of a large market and accelerated development. Then we should be in a better position to to compete with the other parties. Concern has been raised about monopoly privileges. The agreement is going to have a protocol on competition policy, so that those who engage in competitive behavior will be able to go to them and say, this is wrong, and they'll be punished accordingly.
I'm curious to find out why Nigeria showed reticence in signing, and what was the conversation that you guys had with Nigeria?
No, there was no problem. The Nigerians told us that they wanted to have broad-based national level consultations.
Yeah.
And it's a federal state. They had to go to all the states around the country. They had to go to labor, they had to go to academia, they had to go to business. When they had finalized the national level consultations, they informed us that we are now ready. And indeed, they were able to sign in Nigeria in July this year. And they've already communicated to us that work is underway to ensure that they ratify the agreement as soon as possible. So there was nothing since that. They wanted it to undertake national level consultations.
Arancha, I want to quickly focus on a country like Angola. I was there recently, and it's really fascinating because it's a country that was reliant on imports for many decades. Mm-hmm. And now they've taken a very different approach to try and build their own industries. They've had to be very, make strict policies with regards to importation of goods to try and get things processed and made in the country. Mm-hmm. You can only do that if you become slightly protectionist, against imports and things like that.
No, but I mean, Angola's problem was essentially an economy that was relying on oil and gas and no need to care about anything else. By the way, it's not the only country in the continent that has been focusing on basically reaping the fruits of high oil and gas prices. But then when oil and gas prices crash, the economy all of a sudden finds in need to reinvent itself. And this is what's happening in Angola. So today, Angola has to move into diversifying its economy. For that, it has instruments that Angola can use. And it will have to be a bit of on the one hand, on the other hand, because raising tariffs very highly, if it cannot produce those products, is also not going to help with consumers who need cheap prices. So it's going to have to do a bit of here and there to boost more domestic production, while at the same time ensuring affordable prices for consumers.
Do you think that countries like Angola, and any country like Angola on the continent, can embark on a balancing act like that if it is forced to eliminate 90% of tariffs?
It can do that, but it will have to it will do that in a gradual manner, which is what the agreement allows it to do. It does not ask Angola to dismantle 90% of its tariffs on day one. It tells Angola you have to gradually do that. And by the way, in the 10%, you have a bit of a margin of maneuver. But let's not forget that in this discussion, there is producers and there is consumers.
Yeah.
And I don't see really also the Angolan government or any other government, for that matter, not being capable of producing and asking their consumers to foot the bill of protectionist policies that don't protect anybody.
And in fact, these policies have assisted to grow a lot of the local industries, which is incredible to see. It has happened very quickly. So, ladies and gentlemen, I want you to think about this. A Made in Africa label, something that you'll be able to see in the next few years. You buy a product off the shelf and it doesn't say made in South Africa or made in Nigeria, it says made in Africa. I want you to ponder on this. And as we embark on our closing conversations, I want all of our panelists to tell us what the vision is. Ngaire, I'd like to start off with you.
So I think of this continent's decade of negotiations with the European Union on economic partnership agreements, where each country in Africa found itself in a divide and rule strategy by the European Union, pretty powerless in those negotiations. So my vision of this Made in Africa continent is that Africa strides onto the trade negotiation stage as one enormous market, and that will cover services, that will cover manufactured goods, that will be a new engine of growth across the continent.
Patrick.
Made in Africa definitely means that Africa has got to invest more in its energy generation, because industries will require very much energy security to be able to perform and be able to serve the continent. But at the same time, it will also require support and capacitation of our small and medium enterprises, because those are the engines of economic growth. Those are the creators of sustainable jobs in any economy.
Arancha.
For me, Made in Africa is more value added in Africa. It's basically more transformation in this continent using the ingenuity and creativity that the 12 million young Africans that come into the labor market every year can bring to pull together manufacturing, to put together agro-processing and services in more value staying in this continent.
And sir, Your Excellency, you're the man that's going to make it happen. So a comment on Made in Africa, but also, what is the deadline? Are we going to meet it? And then can we take you to task for it when?
Thank you very much. This is the official logo of the African Continental Free Trade Area. And below it, there is the vision. And the vision is creating one African market. And certainly, when you have got one African market, it means that seamlessly, we needed to go towards a label of a brand of Made on Africa. And we are already working on that brand to ensure that it is operationalized as soon as possible. The target for start of trading is the 1st of July 2020, which is close enough. We deliberately chose that target date to give ourselves and member states the time to do preparatory work. At the national level, it's the task of each state party to really sensitize the business community about opportunities of being offered by this market. And when the private sector has been so sensitized, then they also start positioning themselves to take advantage of the market by coming up with additional investments, such as for production and the logistic facilities. Then at the continental level and regional level, we are working with the regional economic communities so that we are able to address all these challenges that have been raised, those related to trade facilitation, those related to competition. So we are very, very, very confident that come 1st July 2020, first we'll be able to trade. Then all the 55 African Union member states would have ratified the agreement so that we start the market under one market. Thank you.
Eritrea hasn't signed it.
They will.
They will.
They will. They made an official announcement in Niamey that they are going to sign, and in November, I'm going to see the government to start the process. So I'm confident that the remaining 28 countries will be able to ratify the agreement before July 2020. I'm very confident about that.
Your Excellency, I cannot wait to speak to you again when we start trading. It is such an exciting time. It's about building value-added sectors. It's about processing our resources on the continent and trading amongst ourselves. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us. Thank you to our incredible panelists for joining us and for your insights. And I wish you all the best.
Thank you.
I know it's a hard job, but thank you so very much. Thank you so much.